of the funny things about reviewing old games is the way in which some of them seem to exist squarely in a singular moment in time. That's not true of everything, of course. Plenty of games that I've come across feel unconstrained by their release context or by presentation that might otherwise be considered dated. But sometimes you get a game that feels like it could only have come into existence at a specific time in a specific context. Take today's subject, for example. The early 2000s were a hotbed of post-90s mega-angst carried by a wave of commercialised counterculturalism, and perhaps nothing typifies that better than the trend of dark retellings of stories, grim fairy tales, and kids decked out in Hot Topic goth gear. Truly, it was an era of Jack Skellington's face leering out at you from the front of notebooks, black and white Scarpunk livery, and Breaking Benjamin backpacks. Of course, in the middle of all that came American McGee's Alice, a grimdark take on Lewis Carroll's famous Odes to Nonsense, and maybe also mathematics. Despite being a home computer exclusive and also bearing all the hallmarks of that dodgy era of early 3D action games, Alice resonated with players. Of course it did. This was the dark age of media after all, when audiences were quote-unquote growing up, and so everything pivoted to being dark and gritty. And yet, despite the plaudits and modest sales success, it would be over a decade before American McGee would bring us back to his twisted, grotesque Wonderland. You're listening to the almighty Backlog. I'm Ellie, and today's review is on Alice Madness Returns. Playable on PC, PS3 and Xbox 360. Originally released in June of 2011, developed by Spicy Horse and published by EA. It's an action, platformer, hack and slash kind of thing. How Long to Beat has it at 16 hours. I think it's probably fair to say that Alice Madness Returns had a fairly turbulent development. That's surprising in a way. Given the response to American McGee's Alice, you'd think a sequel would have been relatively quick in coming. Perhaps that had been in the intent. Certainly McGee was active after the release of Alice, inking a deal to produce a movie based on his vision of Wonderland in short order, though ultimately nothing came of it. Direct plans for a sequel had been stymied by McGee's focus on his take on The Wizard of Oz, predictably titled American McGee's Oz. He's nothing if not idiosyncratic, though that game would wind up cancelled. It would take until 2009 for EA to commission a sequel amid the rise of the original game as a cult classic in the world of PC gaming, not to mention the fact that edgy adaptations of Alice were creeping back in vogue with the then upcoming Tim Burton version aiming for a 2010 release date in cinemas, and a further 2 years for it to hit stores. The end result was, well, about what you'd expect from a return to American McGee's Alice, albeit filtered through a decade of progress in both the PC gaming and action game spheres. In many ways, it's a significant step forward from its predecessor. Where the first was grungy, this one tapped into contemporary steampunk imagery. Where the first felt floaty and loose, this one controls more tightly. And where the combat in the first felt disconnected and janky, this one takes cues from a decade of character action games to build something far more coherent and fluid. We return then to the miserable life of poor Alice Liddell. In McGee's telling of the story, Alice is not a daydreaming child who meanders into the fantastical Wonderland, but a traumatised orphan. In the first game, she is already incarcerated in an asylum. She retreats to Wonderland after years of apparent treatment following the tragic death of her parents and sister in a fire which claimed both their lives and the family home. The Wonderland she finds herself in is twisted and violent, formed from the turbulent waves of Alice's survivor guilt. She meets many of the characters the audience no doubt already knows, but they too have become murderous versions of themselves. Alice's quest through Wonderland sees her eventually overcome the tyrant Queen of Hearts, and in doing so repairs her own mind and restores Wonderland. Would that things were all that easy for Alice. Despite the ending of the first game, by the time of Madness Returns, life is still bad for her. A year on from her release from the asylum, Alice now lives in an orphanage under the care of one Dr. Bumby. The doctor is a hypnotist who claims to help children by using his skill to have them forget memories, so Alice finds herself subject to his guidance as he attempts to purge the last remnants of Wonderland from her mind. It doesn't quite work. As Alice walks the grimy streets of London, her thoughts begin to wander, and she falls once more into the weird world of Wonderland. However, things are not right in Alice's fantasy world. A vast train, ornately built with gothic spikes and belching, billowing clouds of choking smoke and scorching flames, careens through the tranquil forests of Wonderland, tearing the ground to pieces. In its wake, it leaves thick, tar-like ruin, a corruption that seeps down into the core of Wonderland. Met by the Cheshire Cat, Alice is guided back to her trusty weapon, the razor-sharp Vorpal blade, and asked to fight the ruin to its source in order to cut out whatever is causing Wonderland to rot and decay. I confess, while this game used to be right up my street when I was an edgy teenager, I think this kind of reimagining loses some of its luster to an exhausted 30-plus-year-old. There's a certain amount of wariness I found hanging around the edge of my feelings as I played it this time, like my teeth were gearing up to be on edge constantly. I think that's partly down to the game on a conceptual level. These days I find myself side-eyeing so-called dark reimaginings of classic stories because I feel like they perhaps miss the point a bit. Like, you can manipulate a story or setting how you want, obviously. That's the joy of fanfiction after all, and this is nothing if not Alice's Adventures in Wonderland fanfic. But one of the fundamental truths about Carol's work is that it was written in part to celebrate silliness, and in doing so ushered in a new approach to children's literature, one driven not by the need to dryly explain or force lessons upon its readers, but to simply exult in delight and whimsy. By twisting that to tell a mature story, McGee loses sight of a lot of what makes Alice special, painting over it with the arrogance of adulthood. From McGee's perspective, he might argue that his story is about loss of innocence rather than a celebration of it, and in that, he's certainly right. But, and perhaps this is just me being prudish, I find myself balking a bit at another narrative that takes a child. Well, actually, Alice is 19 in this one, and that makes all this okay. Not. But it takes a child and embeds her in a new backstory replete with murder, mental health trauma, and sexual coercion and assault. It is paradoxically juvenile to do this, the kind of thing associated with teen boys in the throes of pushing the boundaries of taste, and I suspect that was the intended audience for this, as opposed to, a 30-odd-year-old trans woman and mother. It's just that it takes a deft hand to approach these topics with any degree of sensitivity, whereas Alice Madness Returns is much more sensationalist, using them as a springboard to build tragic backstories and monstrous levels. Now, that is not going to be everyone's read of this game, and I accept that. If you like it, then fair enough, I'm not here to tell you that's wrong. It's just a game after all, and there does need to be space for art and artists to tell transgressive stories. But if this game no longer holds narrative weight for me, does it at least have mechanical value? Well, yes. In short, Alice Madness Returns is right on the line between full-blown character action and a linear action-adventure game. The combat isn't quite as balletic as, say, God of War or Devil May Cry, but it's got legs. The weapons that Alice picks up in this journey have really fun designs, even if they fall into fairly standard archetypes. The Vorpal blade is for quick slashing attacks, and the chess piece hobby horse is a slow hammer that smashes through enemy defences. Alice is even packing heat in this game, courtesy of items like a machine gun pepper grinder and a teapot that launches explosive gobs of boiling tea. As the game progresses and the base power of each new weapon increases, it can definitely get easy to fall into a pattern of just using whatever's newest to strong-arm your way through enemies, and the teapot here is a particular offender in this case, given how strong it is. But aside from that, I was quietly impressed with the fluidity of the combat. It's an unavoidable truth that the game tends to expect you to use one primary tactic for a majority of enemy types, however, so it is sometimes a bit of a rigmarole to fight through waves of enemies when each one prefers one specific tactic to defeat it. The lack of boss fights is also a startling omission for an action game. McGee seems to have decided at some point during development that boss fights were an overused aspect to contemporary game design, and so cut them in favour of only having a final fight with the main key enemy of the game. That's an odd decision, to say the least, especially as it means that chapters now have no culminating challenge to test the players. Instead, the game putters along, throwing an alternating array of platforming and combat sequences before abruptly ending. That it throws little bait and switches with concluding cutscenes that tease big fights before throwing them under the bus is maybe on brand for Alice, but a shame to my hack and slash pilled brain. In between combat, you'll be platforming across the various perils and pitfalls that Wonderland has to offer. I'm a big fan of Alice's extremely floaty jump, which lets you chain together multiple mid-air spins for more height and distance than you'd think. In a way, it reminds me a little of gliding in Spyro the Dragon. There are maybe too many instant death instances in the game for my liking. I mean, broadly speaking, if you miss a jump or touch one untoward thing, you're a goner, but at least it restarts quickly. If you want variety in the platforming though, you'll be left a little cold, as most challenges repeat themselves pretty consistently through the game. Long jumps that need your glides to be timed right, moving platforms, timers that need to be reset if you fail, and invisible platforms are a constant companion here. The latter are a particularly odd choice, as again, by McGee in my opinion. Early on, Alice comes across a classic archetype of Wonderland, a glass labelled Drink Me, which shrinks Alice down to a tiny size. This is, once again, very on brand for the setting, and I do like how you can do it on demand. The main function of it is as a kind of detective vision from Arkham. When small, the world takes on a hazy purple hue and you can see hidden passages, hints scrawled on walls, and invisible platforms. If you're a completionist, you're going to need to spend an awful lot of time in this mode, as the game has a huge bevy of collectibles, but even if you're just firing through the game for story, you'll need to use it a lot, as hidden platforms are an unfortunate staple of the platforming. You might get the sense that I disliked playing Alice Madness Returns, but I do want to stress that I did actually have quite a lot of fun revisiting it for the first time in a decade. For all the gripes I can bring to bear, they are largely blips rather than sustained issues, and the whole thing manages to come together in an impressively lush way. It's certainly a cool spectacle to see play out, between the oddly creepy papercraft cutscenes that are interspersed between chapters and the incredibly striking design of the game's aesthetics. McGee fully embraces the weirdness of Wonderland in a way that I find really arresting. Islands floating in space, there are huge snails crawling along vast appended bottles that pour out endless waterfalls, there are murky cities built in underwater canyons. My favourite is an entire landscape that resembles traditional Japanese art. And yet, there's also an unsettling underlying element of horror built into this version of Wonderland. It's not a scary game, but McGee understands how to use horror imagery and tropes to get under the skin of the audience. Enemies often have blank, doll-like faces. A late-game chapter takes place through a hellish factory of broken dollhouses and smashed-together baby toys. Some stages are soaked in gore and distended flesh, and levels that have you come across vast waves of butchered denizens of Wonderland are common. It's a remarkable balancing act between the bizarre and the brutal. And it's this atmosphere that carries the game for me. I enjoy the combat and the platforming just fine, and I'm a huge fan of the game's accessibility option of letting me skip all the puzzles with no penalty, especially the sliding blocks, but I'm a real sucker for a game with good vibes. While the writing no longer holds the appeal to me as it did when I was a teen, I've definitely shifted to enjoy a solid hack and slash, and one that also hits me with powerful, evocative aesthetics and level design is also well worth the time in my book. The series might never really return due to the breakdown in the relationship between EA and McGee, but even as a standalone title, this game is a good time. The final score is 4 out of 7. Good. Sure, maybe something doesn't quite work, but at least it has heart, or a spark of excitement, that makes it worthwhile despite the faults. Worth a go if you can find it on sale. This has been Ellie on the Almighty Backlog. You can support this project by reading the review over on thealmightybacklog.wordpress.com, or by listening to the pod review hosted on RSS and YouTube. Please feel free to follow me over on Mastodon, Blue Sky and/or Backlog by following the links on the blog. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so by donating via PayPal to thealmightybacklog@gmail.com, or by hitting the donate button on the website. Thank you for listening, and have a lovely day.